Also, ich glaube, ich warte jetzt noch, wenn das
Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Maybe we just wait a few more seconds because I see that people are joining us by the second, which is nice to see. I hope we're ready to start. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this high panel discussion on the role of the Human Rights Council in promoting human rights-based approach to new and emerging technologies. This event is organized by Austria, together with the Republic of Korea, Brazil, Denmark, Morocco, and Singapore. And we're very grateful to the Diplo Foundation for their support. The group of countries I just mentioned decided about 2 years ago that it was time for the Human Rights Council to take a comprehensive look at the different ways new and emerging technologies impact human rights. So a study on this issue was mandated in 2019 with the overwhelming support of countries from all regions. The final version of this report will be presented in the third part of this event. However, 2 years is a long time when it comes to technology. We're especially honored to have 3 outstanding panelists who will help us make sense of these very fast-paced developments and of how they challenge the international human rights system. We look forward to everybody's active participation, thoughts, and questions a little later on. But to start with, we will begin with a strategic and political reflection on the issue by the UN as well as by some member states. And it is now my privilege to give the floor to Assistant Secretary General Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, who is the officer in charge of the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. In that capacity, Signora Spatolisano is responsible for the follow-up of the Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation. Signora Spatolisano, you have the floor.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all. Minister Schallenberg, Minister Kofod, Minister Burita, Vice Minister Choi, High Commissioner Bachelet, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level panel discussion on the role of the Human Rights Council in promoting a human rights-based approach to new and emerging technologies. The topic of our conversation today is important and timely. The world stands at a pivotal juncture. We are becoming increasingly dependent on technology, which opens a wide range of exciting opportunities. But at the same time, these same technologies pose serious challenges and risks. This meeting itself is an obvious case in point. Government ministries, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders and experts can participate in virtual meetings as long as they have internet access. There are new digital spaces for inclusive consultations, engagement, and thus empowerment of actors. However, malicious actors can seek to disrupt virtual meetings, collect and use data of participants against their will, or conduct targeted surveillance. This dual-edged nature of technology presumes the ability to connect at all. But COVID-19 has shown how the world is digitally divided and unequal, with billions still unconnected and thus unable to make use of technology's potential to help them realize better education, health, and employment outcomes. And even those who are able to connect face the possibility of human rights violations online, something that other speakers will address today, and the growing threat of internet shutdowns or having platforms blocked with little or no notice. Against this backdrop, this month marks the first anniversary of the issuance of the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, which calls for us to connect, respect, and protect all people in the digital age. The roadmap is particularly noteworthy for its important focus on digital human rights, stressing the Secretary General's concern over aspects such as data protection and privacy, surveillance technologies, and online harassment and violence. The Human Rights Council has a key role to play in fulfilling the Secretary General's vision of a more open, inclusive, and secure digital future by implementing the roadmap. In line with this, the roadmap recognizes that, and I quote, greater efforts are needed to develop a further guidance on how human rights standards apply in the digital age, including through the Human Rights Council, and to build upon development, thanks to the joint work of a range of stakeholders, from the Office of the High Commissioner and other UN entities to civil society organizations and the private sector. In his roadmap, the Secretary General also calls on member states to place human rights at the center of regulatory frameworks and legislation on the development and use of digital technologies. Through deliberations and universal periodic reviews, the Human Rights Council can support member states in this task. In addition, we must also think about what more may be needed beyond ensuring that the same rights offline are protected online and coding such protections into law. The Human Rights Council should also consider the issue of internet shutdowns and actions that may force people or platforms offline. As noted in the roadmap, blanket internet shutdowns and generic blocking and filtering of services are considered by United Nations human rights mechanisms to be in violation of international human rights law. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, engagement by the UN and its member states is not enough to effectively addressing the human rights dimensions of new and emerging technologies. As noted in the roadmap and in the guiding principles on business and human rights, companies too have obligations to uphold human rights. I commend the efforts of the Human Rights Council and by agencies, civil society organizations, scholars, and other stakeholders based in Geneva to devote so much time and effort to addressing these issues, ensuring accountability and giving a voice to the most vulnerable. In concluding, as the Secretary General repeatedly emphasized, the UN stands ready to be that platform where this discussion can take place with the widest possible range of actors. And the Office of the Envoy on Technology is there to facilitate discussions and welcome ideas and partnerships. Together, we can make sure that the technological advances of tomorrow do not come at the expense of the fundamental, universal human rights we pledge to uphold, defend, and promote. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Signora Spatolisano, for this opening speech. And we now have the pleasure of listening to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, my thanks to the permanent missions of Austria, Korea, Brazil, Denmark, Morocco, and Singapore for organizing, along with my office, this important event to address the role of the Council in addressing challenges and gaps in applying human rights in the technology sector. It also provides a useful opportunity to discuss the Advisory Committee's recent report. In its call for action for human rights, and following up on the recommendations of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, Secretary General Guterres called for the development of a human rights-based framework for the digital space. Our existing human rights framework provides essential guidance to the use and governance of digital technologies. Only by applying human rights law and honoring the commitments made under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the core international human rights treaties can states hope to fully benefit from the potential of digital technologies. Equality is one of those commitments we have been failing to implement. Despite the significant benefits of digital technology, half of the world's population is still not even connected to the internet. Disproportionately, they are women and members of ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. Human rights defenders, journalists, and many others, creative and constructive voices face oppression when they dare to speak up online. The internet has often become a space for surveillance, intimidation, and the preparation of violent attacks in many contexts and across every society. Some digital corporations benefit from huge impact on public discourse without being bound by human rights-based governance frameworks. And many governments seem increasingly determined to impose new rules in the digital space while failing to protect users and their rights. Just in the last few weeks, for example, we have seen authorities in various countries demanding the takedown of Twitter posts or the blocking of websites and services because they were used to criticize the government. I remind this and other states that criticism, online or offline, is not a crime. It is a necessary element of any vibrant society. Numerous resolutions of the Human Rights Council have addressed digital issues. Those include the resolutions on new and emerging digital technologies and on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the Internet, both of which will again be discussed during the next Council session. The Council's resolution on the right to privacy and the safety of journalists constitute essential and landmark guidance. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provides a practical framework and reference point. Other human rights mechanisms have also contributed vital guidance, including CERD on racial profiling, the CRC on the rights of the child in the digital environment, and the Human Rights Committee on Freedom of Expression and Freedom of Peaceful Assembly online. In addition, an impressive amount of work has been done on digital issues by the Council's special procedures. My office is fully engaged on this front through our cooperation with the Human Rights Council and partners across the UN, in collaboration with member states, tech companies, and civil society. Allow me to share with you a few examples. We have developed the United Nations Hub for Human Rights and Digital Technology in follow-up to the Secretary General's call to action and roadmap for digital cooperation. We are now engaged in developing internal-facing due diligence guidance for the UN's own procurement, development, and use of digital technologies, leading efforts for the UN itself to show the example. Our multi-stakeholder BTech project provides resources and authoritative guidance for implementing the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights in the technology space. Our office also engaged directly with a range of tech companies, in particular social media platforms, to advocate for their practices and policies to be based on human rights law. Key points include increased transparency of decision-making, strengthening accountability, and rights-based content policies. Excellencies, my office will continue to report to the Human Rights Council on these crucial issues. We're currently preparing a new report on the impacts of artificial intelligence on the enjoyment of the right to privacy. Ensuring that the digital space works to uphold and advance human rights is an essential priority for all of us. I look forward to enhancing our collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam High Commissioner. And it is now my special pleasure to hand over the floor to the Foreign Minister of Austria, His Excellency Mr. Alexander Schallenberg.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives in many ways. One of the most notable consequences is the significant acceleration of the digital transformation. The pandemic has made us even more reliant on digital technologies. This crisis has proven again that technology can be a blessing. It can work as an enabler of rights and freedoms, allowing people to reach out beyond geographic boundaries and beyond social and community groups. But we all know that new technologies are not automatically beneficial. Neither are they neutral. They always embody the values and biases of those who create and employ them. New technologies are not always used for good intentions. We must not close our eyes when digital technologies become instruments of repression, when the digital divide reinforces existing discrimination and vulnerabilities, when we lose meaningful human control, as in the case of autonomous weapon systems, and when artificial intelligence, together with behavioral targeting, changes the way our opinions are formed. To put it bluntly, whether something takes place online or offline cannot and should not make any difference when it comes to respecting human rights. The virtual space is not a lawless space where human rights do not apply and the law of the jungle prevails. Ladies and gentlemen, new technologies make our lives more convenient, simplifying decision-making, keeping track of our shopping list, tastes, and interests. Negative effects usually occur with a delay, as we have experienced, for instance, with lacking safeguards for end users and lacking data protection. If effective protection mechanisms are not built into new technologies from the beginning, it becomes much more difficult and challenging to establish them in the future. The technological evolution is racing ahead at phenomenal speed, but international safeguard mechanisms are lagging far behind. We, as international community, need to wake up and open our eyes. It is essential that we quickly come to a common understanding of how to best protect human rights in the digital age, how human rights due diligence can be observed at all stages of the tech life cycle, and how we can translate existing rules of international law to new technologies and use what the High Commissioner has called an intelligent mix of measures without suppressing innovation. And this debate should not exclude the tech industry. On the contrary, we have to make them and other stakeholders actively part of it. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel to address most of these issues. The guiding principles on business and human rights provide us with valuable orientation for both states and businesses. We all know that usually it is the first movers who shape the debate, and I strongly believe that the Human Rights Council should be this first mover. Following the Council's groundbreaking resolution on new and emerging digital technologies and human rights, adopted through an inter alia Austrian initiative in 2019, today's high-level panel is a further important step. I am very pleased that the report by the Advisory Council on New and Emerging Digital Technologies and Human Rights will be presented at this event. And I hope that this report and our discussion today will feed into a new resolution by the Human Rights Council on this issue, which is of central importance to the future development of human rights. This is about nothing less than what kind of world we want to live in. A world where new technologies are instruments of empowerment instead of repression, where they are catalysts for inclusion instead of division, and where they reflect the values and principles that are the building blocks of our societies: openness, respect for human rights, and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And it is now my privilege to give the floor to His Excellency Nasser Bourita, the Foreign Minister of Morocco. Vous avez la parole.
Madam High Commissioner, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to express my appreciation to the co-organizers of the high-level event and all participants with us today. It is no doubt that we all benefit from technological advances. The COVID-19 pandemic is yet another unquestionable proof of the centrality of new technologies in our lives. Thanks to technologies, administrations and business were able to maintain a certain level of operations. More importantly, new technologies allowed humans to stay connected with the outside world and with each other. In this context, I would like to emphasize four main challenges that I believe require a peculiar attention in the context of new and emerging technologies. First, the environment. New technologies have definitely allowed tremendous positive impacts on the environment, including the development of renewable energies and advancing recycling techniques. Therefore, the Human Rights Council needs to pay a particular attention to the impact of new technologies on human rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Similarly, Morocco would highly encourage the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment to dedicate one of his upcoming reports to this issue. Second, the economic and social impact of new technologies. When it comes to new technologies, as much as it is undeniable that these advances strengthen the enjoyment of human rights in general and economic rights in particular, they also negatively affect some important social rights. Terrorism has also been flourishing with new technologies, including through online recruitment by terrorist groups, spreading of hate speech, transfer of money, etc. Third, the digital gap and divide between the global north and the global south. Thanks to new technologies, many individuals and groups have been able to speak up for their rights and raise awareness about their specific situations and needs. Therefore, it is essential to guarantee a better accessibility to technologies in Global South, including through the transfer of technology, technical assistance, and capacity building. And I'm thinking here in particular of my continent, Africa. Fourth, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is by far one of the most powerful technological advances with incredible positive impact on our livelihoods in a wide area of fields. In this regard, there is an imperative to bring in the IT world and the human rights world together, training engineers on human rights and evolving human rights experts in algorithm developments. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The Kingdom of Morocco is fully aware of the tremendous positive potential of new technologies in improving its citizens' life and advancing human rights while remaining alert to their challenges. The visionary approach of His Majesty, the King Mohammed VI, has made new technologies and digitalization of various sectors a major challenge to transform the access and quality of public services, improve economic inclusion, and reduce the digital divide without ever giving up on the human rights that are at stake. Morocco also attaches great importance to advancing education and gender equality and relies on digital tools to identify and address human rights violations such as discrimination, harassment, and increase women's access to education through e-learning. The new development model that was recently presented to His Majesty the King emphasizes in turn that digital technology is a real leverage for change and development. It calls for it to be given special attention as a catalyst for high-impact transformations. Therefore, Morocco believes that there is a need for the international community in general and the Human Rights Council in particular to work together by implementing the 3 C's: common approach, coordination, and cooperation. Common approach by harmonizing the regulatory framework and working on a shared understanding of the topics at hand. Coordination through planning, inclusive and diversified dialogue and action, including by fully integrating the private sector. And finally, cooperation, aiming at bringing every country to the same level. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Our next speaker is the Foreign Minister of Denmark, His Excellency Jeppe Kofod. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, or good morning and good evening to everyone. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her statement and her office for organizing this event with the core group. I also wish to thank the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee for its report. I'm happy to see that the committee recommends a multi-stakeholder approach as a way forward. We find that this is the right approach. Responsible digital technologies hold great potential for promoting human rights, enhancing civil engagement, and supporting democratic institutions. Yet the use of digital technologies may also challenge human rights. These challenges are complex, ranging from non-transparent use of data-driven business models and algorithms to disinformation, internet shutdowns, and infringement of civil spaces online. To overcome these challenges, we must encourage closer cooperation between all relevant stakeholders and foster more exchanges of best practices. Denmark is ready to do its part. Earlier this year, we launched a strategy for our tech diplomacy. Now we are launching a new Tech for Democracy initiative. It aims to promote international partnership around challenges posed by technology to democracy and human rights. It includes protecting civil spaces online and engaging with tech industry to promote that businesses respect human rights in their products and services. As part of Tech for Democracy, we are inviting a broad group of stakeholders to a conference in Copenhagen this November. We will draft a joint action agenda and seek out venues and partnerships to promote and protect human rights and democracy in the digital age. To ensure active engagement and long-term impact, we will also consult with civil society, the tech industry, and other stakeholders in the coming months. Making best use of digital technologies is one of the most pressing questions of our time. We need to keep the multi-stakeholder dialogue going to get it right. Today's event and the work of the Human Rights Council contributes to that dialogue, and I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We now turn to the last speaker of this segment, the Vice Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, His Excellency Mr. Choi Yong-moon. You have the floor, sir.
High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, Assistant Secretary General Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, His Excellency Minister Alexander Schallenberg, His Excellency Minister Yebe Kofod, His Excellency Minister Nasser Bourita, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for the Korean government to co-host today's high-level panel together with the core group members. Today's gathering focuses on the new frontier of human rights. This is very timely and appropriate against the backdrop of both the new opportunities and challenges brought by the pandemic. COVID-19 has ushered in, or at least catalyzed, an era of remote work, education, and medical care, and it has also shown the promise for the future of the AI-powered networking. In this vein, digital technologies have been utilized to promote human rights in relation to health, freedom of speech, and access to information. For example, digital technologies enable us to deliver effective public health services, provide a virtual forum for communication, and give access to a wealth of information. In fact, the Korean government has made valuable use of digital technologies in countering the pandemic. From identifying and isolating confirmed cases to prevent a lockdown to vaccination, digital technologies have been an invaluable tool. Recently, the Korean government has introduced a blockchain-based COVID-19 vaccination verification system to assist our society to return to normal while protecting privacy at the same time. The leftover vaccines reservation system also helps people to receive COVID-19 vaccines made available from canceled appointments through a mobile phone, thereby aiming to minimize the waste of remaining doses. However, the pandemic emphasized importance of a human right-based approach in the application of digital technologies. As the report of the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee articulates, the utilization of digital technologies has brought to light the possibility of privacy violations arising from excessive datafication. As misinformation continues to be rampant online, governments and private companies alike have given thought on the ways to ensure freedom of expression while fighting the infodemic at the same time. While digital technologies have enabled schools and businesses to keep functioning, this has also brought uneven digital empowerment, which has had the unintended effect of aggravating existing economic inequalities. In this vein, the Korean government has invited deeper attention to the human rights implications of digital technologies with the adoption of a Human Rights Council resolution in 2019. Now it is clear that digital technologies hold both opportunities and challenges, and we need to approach the issue in a holistic, balanced, and pragmatic manner. This year, we plan to table another Human Rights Council resolution on new and emerging technologies and human rights at the 47th session. I believe that the active engagement of the Council will be of great value. We expect that this will spur discussions between a whole range of multi-stakeholders, including government, businesses, civil society, and academia. Korea is indeed ready and willing to fully engage with all member states and relevant stakeholders. I hope today's event contributes to the goal of promoting and protecting human rights in digital space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And this brings us to the end of the first segment. I will now hand over to the moderator of the second segment, but not without having, first of all, very much thanked and welcomed those participants of the coming panel from across the Atlantic who had to get up at impossible hours to join us. Thank you very much for doing that. The moderator of the second segment will be Charlotte Stix. She is an expert for technology policy. She was a coordinator of the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence at the European Commission. She served as a fellow at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge and regularly advises technology companies on the topic in this area. Charlotte was awarded among the 2020 Forbes 30 Under 30 and named a Young Global Shaper by the World Economic Forum. Charlotte, you have the floor. Please take over from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for these very inspiring opening speeches. I'm certain that many of these key considerations touched upon will resurface again in the coming hours in our panels. So I'm Charlotte Six, and I have the pleasure to moderate the coming two panels with a host of wonderful speakers. Before I dive in and introduce the panels and the speakers, I would like to take a brief moment to go through some housekeeping. So the panels will run for roughly 45 minutes with an introductory note by the panelists and a panel discussion. There is a chat option, which I see many of you have already found, where you can ask questions that I will then include in the discussions. Each panel will also conclude with a short Q&A session with an open floor. We have a list of speakers for this open floor session, and should you wish to speak, please raise your hand virtually, of course. In between the first and the second panel, we will have a short break for about 15 minutes. Please keep your mic switched off unless you have the floor. Be respectful of all other speakers when engaging. And if you have not yet done so, please add your name and your country to the little tag on this chat so we know who you are and who you represent. So our first panel is going to discuss how we can apply human rights to technology. In particularly, what norms should we be using? Where are the gaps, and how can we identify them earlier? How can we tackle them? And where are the major challenges now and in the future? So I have the pleasure to have virtually here with me Dr. Eileen Donohoe, who is the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center, where she works to develop global digital policies that address human rights, security, and governance challenges. She served as the first US ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva during the Obama administration. After leaving government, she was the Director of Global Affairs at Human Rights Watch, where she represented the organization worldwide on human rights foreign policy. I also should highlight that it is 5 a.m. in the morning for Eileen. So thank you very much for joining us at this early hour. We really appreciate it. Next, I introduce our second speaker, who is Julie Orona, who is the Executive Director of the Internet Sans Frontières, so the Internet Without Borders, a leading organization that defends digital rights and access to the Internet, and one of the 20 inaugural members of the Facebook Oversight Board. Her work focuses on creating channels of collaboration between different sets of actors on the Internet. She's a non-resident fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University, an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and a member of the Global Partnership on AI. Last but not least, our third speaker, Stephen Béraud, who is the Deputy to the Director of the ITU Development Bureau. He's an experienced regulator with more than 20 years of executive and senior management experience in regulatory bodies in the Caribbean region. Prior to joining the ITU, he was Chief Executive Officer of the Utilities Regulation and Competition Authority in the Bahamas, which regulates the ICT and electricity sectors, advises the government on policies related to those sectors, and represents the Bahamas at international sector-related organizations. So thank you very much for participating in this very important discussion. And we're all very much looking forward to hearing your insights. Therefore, without further ado, I will invite each speaker in the turn that I just introduced you to kindly give a short opening statement. So Eileen, if we may begin with your thoughts, please.
Sure. Well, first, let me say thank you so much to the organizers. It is wonderful to see such intensity of focus on human rights in the digital context and this strong response to the Secretary General's call to action. I will say as a first thought that the advisory committee report shows a very high level of sophistication about the challenges we all face. So as was just mentioned, this panel is really about norms, gaps, and challenges with respect to human rights and technology. I thought I would start with the challenges. And just note, as context, the ever-evolving challenge related to technology that we face. In fact, the challenges keep morphing before our eyes, and it's very hard to stay up with this topic. I still have very vivid recollections of the 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe at the Human Rights Council. It was really the height of the internet freedom movement, and that was the phase where that first resolution on internet freedom was passed by consensus, laying down that foundational concept of human rights being applicable online as well as offline. That perception that technology is primarily for good and will benefit human rights has changed over the past decade. We now recognize that digital technologies are both the primary means through which human rights are exercised and through which human rights are violated. But we also know that the rapid development of digital technology is not a process that is going to be stopped. So I want to briefly mention four challenges or four levels of challenge that I think we need to address. And the first is simply at the practical level. The core challenge we face is how do we capitalize on the benefits of technology for economic development, exercise of human rights, fulfilling the sustainable development goals, at the same time that we protect against the risks to the whole spectrum of challenges to human rights, and make sure that we do not exacerbate existing inequality and worsen the existing digital divide. Some of these themes have already been picked up. That's a tough combination, that balancing act, capitalizing and protecting against the risks, but that is the essential task. It's a very practical one. Second challenge that we must address is at the conceptual level. And I will note this was an area handled really well in that advisory committee report. Digitization of society is a system change. It really is a paradigm shift for everyone. We cannot deal with the impacts of digital technologies as a series of discrete problems. We really need a holistic picture and way to address them together. The digital transformation of society has affected every sector, and it has dramatically altered the context in which governments must operate and in which human rights must be protected. So this leads to the third level of challenge, which is challenges to governance models and competition between governance models. Digitization of everything has been incredibly disruptive for democracies and human rights-based governance. Digitization has created so many types of systemic, society-wide security vulnerabilities, and democratic human rights-based governments are struggling to live up to their basic obligation to protect the liberty and security of citizens in this radically changed context. In fact, I have to say that many governments have failed to adapt the existing human rights framework to this radically changed environment, and they themselves are drifting away from adherence to human rights in their own use as well as regulation of digital technology. On top of that, we see tensions between democratic governments over what protection of fundamental rights in the digital context actually entails. And all of this is leading to a general erosion of confidence in the feasibility of adhering to human rights in digital society. And that, to me, is the big problem. While democratic governments are struggling, on the other side of the equation, authoritarian governments seem to be thriving in the digital context. Authoritarian-leaning governments have figured out how to capitalize very effectively on digital technology for repression and control. And that's because digitization makes it very easy to track and monitor what's going on. We see a dramatic increase in new forms of both mass and targeted surveillance. Digital technology also makes it easy to shut down access to information, to censor speech, filter content. Obviously, we've seen a dramatic erosion in the fundamental right to privacy in the digital context, which is, as we all know from reading all the reports over the last decade from UN special rapporteurs on privacy, free expression, freedom of assembly and association, that privacy is foundational to the exercise of all types of liberty. And I will also mention that with AI and the new developments there, we have a whole new level of control that may be available to governments. There are new AI-driven systems with predictive and mind-shaping powers that put concepts of human agency, autonomy, accountability, and even dignity at risk. So AI really has the potential to be a game changer. And this is why it is so important. We really do need to do the hard work and bring a human rights lens to international governance of AI. Last, that leads me to the fourth level of challenge, which is really geopolitical. We have seen this global trend away from human rights-based governments, and we see an authoritarian model of governance spreading around the world with a promise of control and security for the state rather than for citizens. And that model is spreading through a variety of means. One is simply through the export of digital tools for surveillance and censorship. We also see the export of entire digital information systems through which authoritarian governments are actually gaining leverage in different societies around the world. We see that model spreading through the diffusion of authoritarian norms and concepts in diplomatic arenas and normative arenas like the Human Rights Council, as well as the spread of concepts like cyber sovereignty, which from my vantage point is actually like an updated version of a longstanding authoritarian position that is contrary to the basic human rights principles. The idea being that what happens within our borders cannot be criticized from the outside, and that human rights do not provide a basis for external criticism. And that is something we really need to resist. So the basic idea here is that I do believe the existing international human rights law framework should and can serve as the normative foundation for governance of digital society and guide regulation of digital, new and emerging digital technologies. We've observed that many in the tech industry have not previously been exposed to this framework. And so we've seen an unfortunate proliferation of hundreds of new sets of principles for governance of technology. And I think what we really need to do is advocate for the use of human rights as the foundation. It so far surpasses any other alternative. Because it is already accepted under international law. This is an internationally recognized framework negotiated in the aftermath of the crisis of World War II. It would be virtually impossible to get an equally potent international framework at this juncture. The framework also speaks to the full spectrum of risks associated with digital technologies related to privacy, free expression, equal protection, non-discrimination, right to work, right to adequate living. And it also, as several have mentioned, speaks to the roles and responsibilities of both government and the private sector. And obviously the basic texts speak to the primary obligation resting with states, but we've seen the governance, innovation, and the guiding principles on business and human rights that I know will be spoken more about in the next panel, that updates the framework and brings it into 21st century digital context where the private sector is playing such a dominant role in impacting human rights. Last point, yes, there are gaps. So the existing framework, I think, serves as the foundation, but there are ways in which it needs to be adapted and we need to articulate how to apply it in the new digital realm. I will point to one exercise that happened, I believe, in roughly the 2013 timeframe post-Snowden, where civil society, a coalition of civil society, did excellent work in articulating how to apply the necessary and proportionate principles from the human rights framework in the context of surveillance. And I think that is the type of exercise that needs to happen with respect to all different types of technology applications. So let me just close by saying we do not need new principles. Our principles are enduring. We have founding texts that were drafted and agreed to internationally at a moment of global crisis. And we need to rely on that framework for governance going ahead. But the hard work we need to do is to develop new doctrine in how we apply those principles and that framework to our new context. And I really do think that the advisory committee report is an excellent start to that work.
Thank you, Eileen. That was certainly thought-provoking, and I'm interested to see this discussed in our panel discussion. So, Julie, if you would like to share your opening statement, please.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. First and foremost, thank you so much to the permanent missions of Austria and of Korea, Morocco, Brazil, for convening this very important discussion, and also thank you to the excellencies who provided introductory remarks earlier, particularly the ministers of various countries represented. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be talking. I mean, for me, an honor to probably introduce to some of you, or at least to tell you a few additional words about the Facebook Oversight Board and how it relates to our discussion today. But before that, I would like to wholeheartedly agree with what Dr. Donahue has just brilliantly exposed. This is a very interesting moment in history. And I would go even further as to say that precisely because of these challenges that we're facing, and in terms of norms and in terms of harms that we're seeing caused by technology and potential harms caused by technology to our rights, I think this is an interesting moment for experimentation, and particularly experimentation in the governance, in the protection of the human rights that we enjoy offline and online. And I would say that to this regard, the Human Rights Council has been at the forefront of this conversation, at the forefront of making sure that we have achievements in the protection of human rights in the technology and digital age. I'm speaking from a place of experimentation. The Facebook Oversight Board is precisely this. It's first of all an experiment in knowing how to enforce, how to protect freedom of expression on social media platforms, and particularly in a very discussed area, which is content moderation. What should be seen, what should be available, what should be allowed to be written, published, and shared on social media platforms and online platforms in general. That's the first part of the experimentation. And the other part of the experimentation is it even possible at scale? We're talking about billions of content published every day on platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. Is it even possible to scale this meaningful moderation, or at least a human rights-based moderation of our content and what we are allowed to say on social media platforms? While I cannot give at this stage a definitive answer to that, what I can say is that the Facebook Oversight Board, from my perspective, as a digital rights activist, as a civil society leader, and also as a lawyer, my perspective is that I feel we are in a very interesting space, or at least a very promising promising space. The Facebook Oversight Board was created and launched officially in May 2020, so it's been a bit more than a year now. But we have to remember it's the conclusion of a long process and of a multi-stakeholder process. Multi-stakeholderism is really a governance model that is extremely beneficial for the discussion that we're having today. The Facebook Oversight Board is a result of a month and month of discussions of conceptualization and collaboration with civil society organizations to draft what would become the first bylaws and charter of the Facebook Oversight Board. My organization, Internet Without Borders, participated in 2 sets of consultation organized by the company Facebook. Consultation which gave us the opportunity to address concern with regards to the draft that was presented to us at the time. Most of our concerns were related to, independence of the institution, the body that would come out of this. I will come back to that later. It also related to the global perspective that this body would bring in, because we have to remember that we're talking about global platforms that are developed and used in various countries of the world, virtually all member states of the United Nations. So the Facebook Oversight Board is a result of that process, of that multi-stakeholder process. And even in its ongoing operations, it has multi-stakeholderism at its heart. Through different means. First of all, we are a body that receives appeals on content that should be taken down or should have been taken down. Appeals from not only users. So if you're a Facebook user, you see a content that you think shouldn't be there, you can appeal to the Oversight Board. If you see a content or your content has been taken down, you can appeal to the Oversight Board. But we also receive referrals rather, by the company itself, by Facebook, when it faces challenges in applying its own rules to content that is available on their platform. I should note that the Facebook Oversight Board's remit is related to content on Facebook and Instagram, 2 of the major social media platforms that are available today. Another aspect in which multi-stakeholderism is extremely present is through the public comments that we allow organizations, individuals to send to the board whenever it receives and accepts a case. The most famous case that we have received so far, which was that of the former president of the United States, whose accounts had been suspended on Facebook and Instagram. This case has garnered a lot of attention, and we have received a lot of recommendations and public comments from the public, close to 10,000 to be more precise. But why is this particular procedure extremely important to the board members? It's because through these public comments, the board members are able, first of all, to see the case through another lens. There are probably aspects that we had not foreseen upon receiving the case on our desk, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's extremely important because the board is allowed to make recommendations to the company, to Facebook, with regards to its policies, to its community standards, and with regards to how it handles speech in general on its platforms. So through these public comments, we are able to get additional insights into the recommendations that we should make sure to make to the company. Again, the latest and the most famous case that we worked on, that of former President Donald Trump, allowed us to make recommendations, for instance, related to how Facebook's platforms may have contributed to what happened in the United States on January the 6th, 2021. Other recommendations that we made upon reading some of the very thoughtful comments that we have received. The other recommendations that we have made to the company was to review its newsworthiness policy, which allowed the company to leave content published by public figures, politicians particularly, in the name of public interest and newsworthiness particularly. What is interesting also, and with the Facebook Oversight Board, and which shows the extent to which multi-stakeholderism can be very beneficial in the protection of our human rights online, is that the board is allowed, as I said, to make recommendations to the company. What is interesting is that although those recommendations are non-binding, contrary to our decisions when we tell the platforms to put back or to take down a content, well, although not non-binding, these recommendations have to be addressed publicly, responded to publicly by the company. And the company has to explain why it will implement this recommendation and why it will not implement these other recommendations. This open conversation is extremely important. First of all, because it gives additional insight into the challenges that are faced by companies. It is true that there is a lot of criticism, and I'm the first one to make such criticism. There is a lot of criticism to be made against companies, against social media platforms, particularly when it comes to protecting our human rights online. But these companies are facing challenges too. And through this open conversation, through this additional layer of transparency, organizations such as mine, but also users and governments are well more aware of those challenges. What is also extremely interesting with those open conversations around the Facebook Oversight Board's recommendations is that we can track the progress of the company. Not only does the company respond to this recommendation, but it also gives information into how it is performing in implementing those recommendations. These are some of the
very interesting. I'm afraid we'll just have to wrap up so we can get to all of the important questions afterwards.
Thank you, Charlotte.
We have so much more to
I just wanted to wrap up and to say that multi-stakeholderism is really at the heart of how the Facebook Oversight Board functions, and I strongly encourage as many stakeholders as possible to participate and to help us through public comments and collaborations. Thank you so much for the time.
Brilliant, thank you. Stephen, now if you would like to share your opening statement, please.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with the distinguished columnists. I've already learned so much from all of you. So I'm going to build on some of the comments that I've made already, and maybe shift things a bit based on my own perspective and the ITU, and particularly the development sector's perspective. So, of course, ITU has been at the heart of advances in communications globally as the UN specialized agency for telecommunications for 150 years. But the ITU's mandate is committed to connecting all of the world's people, wherever they live, whatever their means. That theme of connecting the unconnected is not just an issue of putting infrastructure in place, it's about supporting that infrastructure by effective strategies, policies, regulatory strategies, and understanding future trends, technical, social, and economic. In addition to our development role, ITU makes standards which are fundamental to the operation of these networks. So without these standards, we couldn't make a telephone call or surf the internet. We also coordinate the radio communications frequencies that allow mobile technologies and other wireless technologies to work. But the focus I want to give is about the rights focus generally, and how through ITU's work, we protect and support everyone's fundamental right to communicate, the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information. And I want to explore this concept as a right in itself, because of course I come from a development bureau of a specialized technical agency, and I'd like to also look at the developing country perspective. So my question is in our focus, which is aligned with the report of the advisory committee on ensuring that human rights provide a foundation for technology development. We can't forget that the right to communicate is still, at its most basic level, being impaired around the world by a lack of connectivity for so many global citizens. And that this impairment is widening the gap between the haves and have-nots in so many areas, whether we're looking at healthcare, education, and other rights. COVID-19 in particular, and since the pandemic, it's shown that the power of connectivity and reinforced the need to accelerate transformation and to build resilience. But have we reached or are we approaching an era where connectivity should be seen as more than just an enabler of other rights, but as a right, almost a right in its own regard? And if that's the case, what of the unconnected? Today, almost half of the world's population is still not using the internet. That's at the last count we did, 3.7 billion people left offline. So while we're all speaking of the challenges of technology from a human rights focus and in the context of the report, I want to address the issue of those who still do not have connectivity, or those for whom, and I was interested to hear Eileen's comments, that connectivity might be impaired because of whether it's government or other restrictions on their use of connectivity. What is their plight? The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the inequalities between the digital haves and the have-nots, both within and out and between countries. So as we strive to deliver on the promise to leave no one behind, we need to provide the right to communicate to everyone. So we urgently need to address the connectivity and access gaps that remain and build back better, but with broadband for everyone. These gaps between developing and developed countries, for example, in the area of connectivity, still limit the ability of billions to be part of this discussion and the thousands of other discussions like it that are happening every day. These include issues with special circumstances of children with disabilities and their access to the internet when it comes to risks and harms for children on the internet, and issues around new technological developments, all provide an even wider gap for those who don't have. I'd like to touch on one other point before I try to allow some time, because I want to hear more from others. But the second point is, how should international organizations like the ITU position ourselves to fulfill our own mandates in this new paradigm offered by this critical space? And I think this is an issue that was very much tackled head on by the advisory committee's report. While we have these emerging technologies, AI, image processing, voice-driven interfaces, digital platforms, and others, making inroads in areas like education, energy, agriculture, health, which could really revolutionize the lives of communities in all nations, including poorer ones. These, as we've noted before, raise real concerns over the need to protect privacy, to ensure accessibility and inclusiveness, and to ensure interoperability. These technologies will likely eliminate certain types of jobs. They have ethical and human rights implications, and they have risks that perpetuate the barriers to equality we try to eradicate. So I will try to get through this quickly. One of the things is, we as ITU have an example. So how do international organizations with our own mandates, that might be health or education or science, how do we approach addressing these issues in a collaborative way? Our primary goal must be to ensure that the use of technology is ethical, trustworthy, and human-centered, with well-being and safety as the primary considerations. ITU's efforts in the past few years to enhance regulatory frameworks, I'm a regulator, that's my background, that are applicable to ICTs provides a good example. A cornerstone of what ITU refers to as fifth-generation regulation of ICTs recognizes that it's necessary in the adoption of ICTs to have various regulators for each sector collaborate and make occasionally complementary decisions in their own spheres of influence to ensure that the technology is appropriately regulated where it needs to be. A regulatory decision, for example, on mobile money must involve both telecommunications and financial regulators. And there are many similar examples. So in a similar way, we can strengthen, there's merit in strengthening and improving international cooperation. And the Human Rights Council can be a key partner in helping us to understand the myriad of rights involved within our own specialized areas. Emerging technologies can be part of the solution, but the global challenge requires a global approach with intergovernmental collaboration and strong multi-stakeholder cooperation. Let's remember, technology is not an end in itself, but a tool. It can produce positive or negative outcomes, and often both. It's not the responsibility of a sole organization, it's the responsibility of us all. So I just want to close by saying this need for coordination calls for a strong coordination and, above all, clear collaborative framework for the international community to ensure that we don't drown in a morass of views, different work, and different mandates, but that we're able to focus on our own individual entity's mandate with technology as a lens for us to add our voice to the collaborative efforts. With that, Charlotte, I'll pass back over to you to continue the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So we've just had three wonderfully extensive introductions and angles to this topic. So I will now get to ask you more specific questions. I will also be including some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Please try and keep your answers short, sweet, and punchy if you can, so we can get through as many questions as possible. And of course, do feel free to respond amongst one another if you would like to add a point or if you have a counterpoint. So Julie, if I can start with you. So my question is, we're often speaking about two different worlds when it comes to human rights and to the tech community. And partially I'm wondering how we can find a common language. And partially I want to double down on the point you've been making about multi-stakeholderism. So you've been speaking a lot about multi-stakeholderism. So the broader second question would be, how can we increase multi-stakeholder participation in these processes when emerging technologies, concern everything at the end of the day?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. 2 points on that. The first one, and it allows me to respond to one of the remarks made in the chat, is of course making sure all stakeholders are at the same level when it comes to the issues we're talking about. And obviously civil society organizations, especially in developing countries, are not necessarily aware of all the aspects of issues raised with regards to technology and human rights. This is something, and that's the second point that I would like to make. This is something that I personally work a lot on. I think there should be more collaborations between academia and northern countries, which have the scientific knowledge, which have the resources to make the researches, probably not as enough, but still more than civil society organizations, build more bridges, basically, channels of collaborations between these two actors, but also bring further collaborations between the private companies themselves and the communities that are facing, the risks. And many of them are facing them way ahead of majority of users. So I think building more collaborations between these three sets of actors, and also in the conversations that are ongoing between governments and private companies on how to, for instance, better regulate content online. I think these conversations should not be only happening between companies and governments in closed doors, but should and must even, I should say, include those communities who are facing the risk, do not necessarily have the vocabulary to put on those risks, but nevertheless, those risks are very real and they can really backlash in a way more dangerous way. So it's important to include these communities, raise their awareness on the issues that we're talking about.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Yvette Stevens. It's about lethal autonomous weapon systems. So there was attention on the development of lethal autonomous weapons, and it was first brought to the Human Rights Council in 2003 by the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. This subject has been referred to the Committee on Certain Conventional Weapons, where discussions have been going on since 2014 without a lot of progress. So human rights have effectively been dropped in the discussions, even though these weapons, if and when applied, would be allowed to take lives without any clear line of accountability. So I think this question might fit your introduction, Eileen, but if anyone else would like to jump in, please feel free to do so, because you've been saying that human rights frameworks already exist and we should make use of them for certain emerging technology areas, and certainly laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems are one of these technology areas where we can and should apply a human rights framework. And maybe that can contribute in some sense to answer the question that Ms. Stevens has raised.
Yes, so what a great question. And it's asked in a way that it normally is not asked. Here's what I would say is that the one opportunity that I have really seen in the last 5 years is that the so-called security community has started to recognize the relevance of norms to security. And it used to be that if you were either involved in the the big table on international peace and security, or you cared about human rights issues. And now there's a growing awareness of the merger between them and the threats to national security, certainly within democracies, comes from places that were never anticipated, including threats of information as weapons. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is a moment of opportunity to bring the entire human rights framework into all of these conversations, including about use of weapons and autonomous weapons, and make sure that the folks in those responsible for those realms understand they've got a basis to use in the, the right to life, and the right to security in persons is a foundational concept that they really have an obligation to bring into that conversation. And it will actually help them, I think, conceptually frame the issues. In addition, I just have to say, this is another area where the threat from AI undermining human agency, human accountability, needs to be taken really seriously. So again, the human rights framework is the best place to address agency, autonomy, accountability, as well as just human dignity. And all of those things are at stake when it comes to autonomous weapons.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So if any of the other panelists has something to contribute, please just feel free to jump in, right? So Stephen, I have a question for you. There is a growing need for closer relationships, as we have had several times now in these discussions, between the legal, regulatory, technology experts and society, civil society. So in a way, there's different worlds that are mirrored in organizations in Geneva. Where do you see the opportunities in strengthening this cooperation between these different organizations? And to bring in a question from the chat, how could they possibly work together to develop emergency measures on digital technologies that harm human rights? So how could these different actors in Geneva actually collaborate to ensure that there are emergency measures if and when, presumably it is a question of when, an emerging technology becomes out of control, so to speak?
Thank you, Charlotte, and to the audience for the question. I think I guess starting firstly, I've been on two of the three sides that you've mentioned. So the international, the local government, and I haven't managed yet the private sector part, but there's still time. But I think one of the key issues is these organizations, these areas of endeavor, all work with very different rules and very different stakeholder sets, which is a challenge. I think Julie mentioned this about the need to have a more multi-stakeholder approach. And one of the key challenges, of course, is that at the UN, governments work together collaboratively. There is a limited amount of interaction by civil society and so on. And then you get to, when you speak of the internet or speak of technology, you're speaking internationally, like properly internationally, in a space where there is no divide between governments on the internet or private sector on the internet. It is one internet. And unfortunately, though, when you get to individual countries, it's still within national jurisdiction. So you have this possibility, as difficult as most countries have found it, this possibility that national governments can still impose their own positions on the domestic space without regard to the international position. We work very hard, I think, to try to create the ITU famously works on a consensus basis. So we try to create a space where countries will agree and will agree to abide by rules. And I think that's similar to much of the UN, where you are persuasive but not prohibitive or not you can't force things. And this is the challenge that we continue to have, that we work to avoid situations and bad actors, but we cannot control those bad actors and prevent them from absolutely being there. Now, what I do think, though, is that from a perspective of collaboration at the international level, we do need to decide clearly what we're going to collaborate on and how we will collaborate, so that we ensure that we all bring our individual expertise clearly maybe stay out of each other's space a bit more, so that we can bring the right expertise to the table on the right issues and be more focused in our approach. And then, as the final point, be more consistent with how we treat with countries that don't play by the rules, so that this issue can be addressed and really reach the individual citizen, where in fact, in many cases, it's only the country that can do that.
Thank you. What a wonderful answer. So Eileen, another question from the audience. Richard Wingfield shares a concern that not everyone seems to want to use human rights frameworks as the basis for addressing impacts and concerns. So you've been mentioning this proliferation of ethics frameworks and guidelines and principles. So these alternative ethics frameworks are being developed, which are sometimes inconsistent with or weaker than human rights law. So the question is how to counter this trend and how to ensure that the agreed upon human rights framework is the baseline.
Thank you for that question. And I think that we need to differentiate between those who don't want to and those who are unaware of the virtues of the existing framework, but who would be open to it. So when I look at the proliferation of different sets of principles, I think there are many, many well-intentioned actors who are doing that work because they are driven to try to be responsible and think about what should be the relevant norms applied, and they are simply underexposed. And I absolutely see that within the technology community. Certainly in Silicon Valley, when I first started at Stanford, I was stunned by the lack of sophistication when it came to awareness of the international human rights law framework and really relevance of the UN. So that is changing. And I think it's changing because what people know in the technology community is this digital systems are inherently global. They call for global systems. They are inherently transborder in terms of their mode of operation. And so they sort of demand an international, transnational regulatory and normative solution. And that's why the existing international human rights framework is so appropriate for these sets of challenges. And they're also trying to operate in a globe, in place all over the world. And so this is an internationally recognized system and it's a shared language, shared norms. There's always been variability in the application of the norms, but it still provides a framework of shared understanding. And I think the UN, of all places, should be advocating for continued reliance on and updating our doctrine and how to apply it. I will admit to Richard's question, there are some actors who would prefer that we not rely on this system and this framework. And that is where I think we all need to be more sophisticated in subtle movement to sort of undercut confidence in the relevance and the feasibility of adhering to this framework. That's why we have a lot of work to do, but it is possible. I have to say one thing, just in case I don't get another word in here. I think Stephen's point about connectivity is the point. And I just want to say that is the most important human rights issue, that lack of connectivity for almost a half of the world, 48% of the world, is the number one human rights issue, because you not only seek, receive, and impart information, but to exercise all human rights. And I just want to say, those of us focused on civil political rights fully appreciate that connectivity, which is sometimes put into the ESC rights bucket or is thought of as only connected to the SDGs, we get it, and we would love to work with you. So I just had to say that.
So if I might then just pose a question to Stephen to, continue on that point you've just made, Eileen. So ITU's mandate is to provide global connectivity, right? So what role plays, this rights-based approach in your work, and what merit is there in a human rights-based approach? And do you see any gaps? And to add a question from the floor, what is ITU doing to engage states who apply whole or partial internet shutdowns?
Thank you. So in some ways, maybe you've answered some of your question in the second question, because obviously that's one of the gaps. It's certainly areas where our efforts to ensure connectivity is global and universal are interrupted and are used in some ways where technology can be used to deprive rights. And this is a new space in some ways for all of us. The internet built itself over the last few decades, and I don't think anyone saw the endpoint when it started. And certainly the creation of technologies in ITU, our main goal over the last 3 decades has been standards and ensuring that technologies work and ensuring interworking. And out of that interworking has come the internet. So I think I guess to be more direct on the question, that the role or the important thing really is that we continue to develop connectivity, to make it a priority internationally, to ensure that we do achieve global connectivity and we don't stop until we do. And then in relation to how we manage it as we go along, the human rights issue is at the core of what we do, even though we don't necessarily say that. So when you're managing to ensure that people have connectivity, ITU runs, BDT in particular, we run skills development, we look at inclusion, digital inclusion as a key issue for us. So it's intimately connected. We look at Be Healthy, Be Mobile. Everything we do is actually at its core connected to the issue of what are a person's rights to enjoy a better life. I mean, and fundamentally, that's what all of this is about. On the issue of internet shutdowns, again, it's an area where, as I pointed out earlier, unfortunately, mandate stops at the national level. Governments still control what they do, and there's a level of international collaboration that's required to impact that. I think the UN still works through the concept of international solidarity against bad actors, and that's something that we still have to continue to do to ensure that we have the right frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid because you have been giving us so much key insights and angles to think about, we've run a little bit over the time of our discussion. So I will be moving to the open floor now. And we have a list of speakers. As I've said previously, please raise your hand virtually if you would like to speak to. So the list of speakers as it is Brazil, Singapore, Germany, Article 19, and Ukraine. So if you would like to speak thereafter, please raise your hand virtually and we will add you to the list. So as a first speaker from the floor, I would like to invite Ambassador Maria Luisa Escorel de Moraes from the Permanent Mission of Brazil.
Okay. Good afternoon, Charlotte. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Can you hear me well? It is an honor for Brazil to co-sponsor this high-level panel alongside Austria, the Republic of Korea, Denmark, Morocco, and Singapore. We thank all panelists for their thought-provoking presentations and for different perspectives, but complementary perspectives on such an important issue. Besides being a member of the core group presenting the resolution on new and emerging technologies and human rights, Brazil has traditionally promoted in the Human Rights Council other important initiatives related to digital technologies, such as the resolutions on the right to privacy in the digital age and on the internet and human rights. We believe that for the Council to remain relevant in the digital age, it must keep abreast with the rapid technological changes affecting people's lives. New technologies have a great transformative potential. Terms such as big data, artificial intelligence, biotech, and smart cities, once viewed as science fiction, today are current affairs, new ways to make a living, connect people, and access information, have increasingly become part of our daily lives. But for all the opportunities created by new technologies, huge challenges remain to be addressed. Without proper safeguards, the same technologies that can enable individuals to better exercise their human rights can also pose serious threats or aggravate inequalities. This is also true in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which pushed us further and deeper into a more digitalized world. On the one hand, digitalization is allowing for greater use of telemedicine, telework, and online education. It also helps to generate data and exchange information. On the other hand, the crisis has also exposed the wide gap between the connected and the unconnected, both within and among countries, as has been mentioned by the panelists. Against this backdrop, we understand that the promotion and protection of human rights in the world of constant technological change requires special attention, never to hinder innovation, but to consider measures to better benefit from new and emerging technologies while mitigating potential unintended threats. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I must apologize. I didn't completely tell you the correct order. I was too engrossed in the discussion, in the information we had just received. Up next is Mr. Pascal Delis, who is the head of section from the delegation of the EU. So the EU is next.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Can you hear me well? Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you to Austria, to the core group, and to the Office of the High Commissioner for holding this panel. Well, I think the exchanges today have shown very clearly that digital technologies create both opportunities and risks, and that both have been amplified by the pandemic. What I would like to do very quickly here is to provide you a quick perspective from the EU on how we are approaching AI. But before that, I just wanted to react quickly to what Stefan and Eileen said on connectivity, because for us, it's also a very important element. I won't get into the details here, but we are working very closely as EU on pushing technology and digital connectivity through our external instruments of cooperation. And what we are starting a new programming phase, which is extremely important in that context. But in looking at artificial intelligence, first thing I would like to underline, because sometimes it's misunderstood, the EU is fully promoting and embracing artificial intelligence. And we are promoting it, including through massive financial support. So our approach is not about limiting the uptake on AI. On the contrary, some people sometimes make the parallel with EU kind of timidity with technologies such as the GMOs. It is not a right parallel. So our goal here is to make it possible for AI to thrive in our society, but at the same time, take into account the risks that exist, because indeed, these risks are real. They can be material or immaterial to health, safety, and human rights. And very simply, if I wanted to tell you about our approach to AI, it is threefold. First of all, we want AI to respect the existing international human rights laws, standards, which for us are the same for people offline and online, regardless of the technology applied. So the role of the HRC, special procedures, and the Office of the High Commissioner are extremely important. And I thought what Eileen said was very important, how we need also to progressively adapt how to apply the principles of human rights in this new and fast evolving context. At the same time, I would like to also highlight that we are very vigilant on how this applied across the UN. For instance, when some standardization bodies develop standards that may not uphold fundamental rights, and we're very vigilant, and we're not the only ones. The second pillar, I think, of our approach is really to take stock of what we know very well. The race between legal frameworks and technology is always to the benefit of technology and always running behind. And so we need to work with the Human Rights Council. We also need to work with the different processes that have been mentioned, and EU is involved with UNESCO, with Council of Europe, and many other fora such as OECD, also to manage the AI, maybe not at the same level as international human rights law, but it's also very important for us. But the third point, and I think is the core of what I want to tell you today, that as EU, we don't want to wait for international norms to be complete and mature. We have a duty to protect our citizens, and it's a very different perspective from the human rights perspective. We also have a single market that needs smooth functioning, and we cannot afford seeing 27 regulations on AI emerging in the EU. So we've got these two foci that push us to act on artificial intelligence, human rights, protection of the citizen, but also we need a single market that works. And for that, we need regulatory alignment. And I know, Charlotte, you know that very well because you've been involved in the process. And it's in that context that in April, the EU made a proposal for legislation on AI, which includes a lot of provision. I won't get into the details, but what is important to remember, it's a risk-based approach where we define different levels of risks with only very few cases that are prohibited, such as social scoring that someone mentioned earlier on. So what is important here is to say that our approach is very proportionate. We will have different kinds of obligations for different kinds of risks attached to the use of artificial intelligence. If you look at how you're going to grant a loan to a person, if algorithms have biases, it's important to regulate. If hiring, human resources area, if hiring is also biased, you need to regulate. On the other area, for instance, if you look at strategic infrastructures where AI is playing a role, you obviously need to regulate. But in many other areas, it's absolutely free for citizens and companies and researchers to develop and apply artificial intelligence in the EU setting. So I think it's important for our colleagues here to see that we don't want to wait. What we are doing with AI, in a way, is what we've done with GDPR, is what we've done with the Digital Service Act. We are acting at the EU level and hoping also that what we are doing is helping, and I know it is helping, others to develop their own norms. So I will stop here. Just in closing, I want just to reiterate the EU full commitment to the work of the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner, and to thank you again for this opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very much. And just for the panelists to know, I will be asking if you have any brief reactions at the end of the interventions. So the next person to take the floor is going to be Mr. Jonathan Chen, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative from the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Singapore. Mr. Chen.
Thanks, Charlotte. Is the sound good?
Yes.
Great. So let me take this opportunity to thank the panelists for their comprehensive insights on technology and human rights, and also some of the norms and gaps and challenges on this front. I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion thus far, which has brought together varied perspectives from relevant stakeholders. I must say that Singapore is extremely proud to co-organize today's event as a core group member of the HRC resolution on new and emerging digital technologies and human rights. We think this event is timely because the HRC will consider the report and recommendations of the advisory committee on the impact of new and emerging digital technologies on the promotion and protection of human rights at the 47th HRC next week. We certainly welcome the discussion on this issue and efforts to look at this issue in a holistic and comprehensive way. I think it's critical to raising awareness. From Singapore's perspective, there are two realities that we must acknowledge in this discussion. The first is the development of digital technologies is multifaceted, with both opportunities and challenges. And I think the term used earlier by one of the presenters was double-edged. So, during this pandemic, we've really seen examples of how technology has helped, in fulfilling human rights, such as access to healthcare and education. But at the same time, on the flip side of the coin, we've seen that it has created challenges, such as misinformation and fake news. The second reality that I would like to highlight is that rapid technological change affects each state in different ways, and that really depends on how they use technology to attain, various socio-economic and development goals. So in this respect, context is very important. And so these realities underpin Singapore's belief that a pragmatic, inclusive, and holistic approach is required on this subject. We must be pragmatic in identifying where updates to the international human rights framework are required, but at the same time acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. States should really be given the flexibility to deal with the impact arising from these digital developments, taking into account their own unique national and cultural circumstances, and of course, in line with their desired socio-economic and development goals. In Singapore's case, what we are really trying to do and to ensure that new digital technologies are fully harnessed is to lay groundwork that ensures that our population is prepared with the necessary skills to leverage the available new technologies, and also to create a framework that guides the development of digital technologies for business and organizations. And of course, the other very important aspect is protecting our citizens by updating and establishing necessary safeguards. So how we have done this is we have adopted a multi-stakeholder and integrated approach for developing, a comprehensive, pragmatic, and effective solutions to address these challenges. Essentially, what we are doing is trying to create an ecosystem, a supportive ecosystem that facilitates dialogue and is able to evolve at a pace that takes into account the interests of different stakeholders and of course the local context. I shan't go into too much detail, and I don't want to bore everyone, but let's just say that Singapore is looking at issues such as creating a digital readiness blueprint to ensure our population is upskilled and that the more vulnerable sectors of society are not left behind. We're looking at promoting technology such as AI and data sharing, in workplaces, and of course, protection of falsehoods, that could have a negative impact on the fabric of our diverse society. So in sum, I would say that from our perspective, it's really incumbent on all the relevant stakeholders to work together with governments to create a pragmatic, inclusive, and holistic ecosystem that ensures that our societies can reap the benefits of these technologies while protecting them from harmful effects. I have two questions. Rather, I just want two questions I would like to pose to the presenters. One is what they think, what more can be done to create this ecosystem to help our societies leverage on technology, and the second is what can be done to protect them from online falsehoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Ralf Schröer from the German Permanent Mission. Mr. Schröer, please.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Charlotte, for giving me the floor, and congratulations to the organizers for this timely and extremely interesting virtual event. I'll try to be brief. As mentioned, new and emergent technologies have put the focus on human rights, such as the right to privacy in the digital age, with Germany, together with Brazil, is in the core group running the resolution in that name in the Human Rights Council. Tech innovations have complicated our understanding of human rights. We now have to look at the digital dimension entailed in almost all human rights. And secondly, tech companies have a growing human rights relevance, of course. Now, in response in the EU, we have adopted regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation. We look at how to counter disinformation, and we think about how to ensure that AI algorithms do not replicate and augment existing biases leading to discrimination. Now, when we talk about regulation of new tech, it is clear that we need a human rights-based approach with human dignity at its core that aims at preventing human rights violations and abuses and respects the rule of law, that has human oversight, and that looks also at gender equality. Now, one of the many challenges we are facing is the various silos in which the regulation of new technologies are discussed in the Human Rights Council, in the Council of Europe, in UNESCO, in the General Assembly, in companies themselves. And my question to the panel would be, what else and what more can we do to break down those silos and bring together the different streams of the debate? And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Alexander Kapustin from the Deputy German Representative of Ukraine, so from Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I wish to thank the members of the core group on UN emerging technologies for organizing this important discussion. I would also like to thank distinguished panelists for giving insight to the respective topic. Digital transformation with a particular emphasis on empowering individuals is one of the overarching priorities of the state policy of Ukraine. In 2019, the President of Ukraine has initiated the creation of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, which is specifically tasked with turning Ukraine into an advanced digital state with equal opportunities for everyone. Since then, Ukraine has become the first country in the world that has successfully introduced the digital passport for all its citizens and forcing Europe to enact digital driver's license. One of the most important achievements is also the launch of digital portal DIA, developed to simplify access to state service over the internet while paying specific attention to expansion of opportunities for marginalized and vulnerable groups as well as youth and young parents. Another important objective of Ukraine's policy in the field of technology is bridging digital divide. In this context, the Ministry of Digital Transformation conducted a complex research study whose results points to lack of online accessibility and inadequate level of digital literacy as key reasons for existing digital inequalities. In order to address those deficiencies, a goal was set to provide 95% of Ukraine's population with high-speed internet by 2024. As a result of work in this year alone, 6,000 social infrastructure objects, schools, hospitals, libraries in small villages and rural areas will be covered with optic fiber. Meanwhile, the DIA digital literacy project has been developed to provide 6 million Ukrainians with basic digital skills in 3 years, and the accompanying digital accessibility strategy aims to create a real barrier-free environment for everyone. While taking concrete steps at implementation of digitalization and high-tech solutions in line with high human rights standards, Ukraine is open for interaction with international partners in this field. Touching upon broader landscape of new and emerging technologies, one can say that modern stage of development of human civilization can be called as era of digital information, big data, artificial intelligence, but also biotechnology, including synthetic biology and other related technologies. The new and emerging technologies have the potential to help human beings maximize their benefits. At the same time, we have to recognize the growing risk associated with their dual use implication and possible disregard of the fundamental human rights. Finding the right balance between technological developments and human rights protection is therefore an urgent matter. The law always catches up with human relations that undergo constant dynamic development. The human rights are no exception. New technologies which have been actively introduced since mid-20th century have provided people with a number of new opportunities. A person who did not have access to such technology could not always fully satisfy the needs that arise in the realities of the modern world. Thus, at the turn of the millennium, it became clear that the legal consolidation of the full range of individual rights associated with the use of scientific and technological advances is an objective necessity. Thus, the concept of the rights of the new fourth generation appear. Today, they are not fully codified yet. Their distinct list cannot be found in regulations. However, this does not mean that the process of recognizing and consolidation of rights of the fourth generation has not begun. A number of standards already exist and should serve as a starting point. States should also make sure that the private sector, which bears the responsibility for the development of new and emerging technologies, uphold human rights standards. In order to get such a balance, we need stronger cooperation between state actors, governments, parliaments, the judiciary, law enforcement agencies, private companies, and also the public life. And the role of the Human Rights Council in promoting human rights-based approach to new and emerging technologies would be pivotal. To conclude, I would like to remind an ancient wisdom. The person who felt the wind of change should not build a shield from the wind, but windmill. Thus, we urge to unite efforts to jointly search the legal solutions that would ensure the use of technological progress for the benefits of mankind and human civilization. We hope that today's discussion will serve as a contribution to further steps in this direction. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And concluding, I would like to ask Mr. Cullen Birch from Article 19 to take the floor, and then we will conclude with thoughts of the panelists and move on to our second panel. Thank you very much, Mr. Birch, if you would like to take the floor.
Thank you, Charlotte, for giving us the floor. We thank the core group for organizing this important and timely event, and also the speakers for their thoughtful interventions. I'm speaking on behalf of Article 19, an organization focused on the right to freedom of expression. Article 19 welcomes the Human Rights Council's initiative on new and emerging technologies and the advisory committee's report on the topic. We agree that these technologies must be designed and implemented with a sound understanding of the international human rights framework, and support the call for greater multi-stakeholder engagement to ensure these principles are applied in practice. We are nonetheless concerned that states and bodies across the United Nations risk falling into the trap of technology solutionism, and the understanding that these technologies, or certain technologies, will be primarily used for beneficial purposes. We think that there is a need to shift the narrative, with the default position always focusing on the human rights impacts of these technologies rather than their reported positive outcomes. For invasive technologies, such as facial recognition, the starting point for the assessment is to recognize that because of their intrinsic invasiveness, the technology is never harmless. For this reason, states should consider the ban on the deployment of facial recognition as the norm, with the possibility to use it as an exception and justified only in very narrow circumstances. Other technologies, such as emotion recognition, are fundamentally flawed and can never meet the narrowly defined test of necessity, proportionality, and legality. Hence, their development, sale, transfer, and use should be banned completely. The Human Rights Council should take this approach in their future work, including in upcoming resolutions. We support calls for greater communication and collaboration between different stakeholders, such as the Human Rights Council and the ITU, to ensure that norms and standards on new and emerging technologies are consistent with human rights. However, we maintain that the Human Rights Council, in close and meaningful consultation with civil society, is the most appropriately placed body to be establishing the human rights norms and standards to be implemented by others, given that it holds the expertise and is ultimately less likely to be influenced by other factors, such as convenience, cost, and innovation. We thank the core group for organizing this event and giving us the floor.
Thank you so much for this statement. I would now like to ask the panelists each to have a one-sentence closing statement in regards to the discussions you've just had. Please, if we could start with Eileen.
My one sentence is this should be a symposium next time rather than a short panel. I guess the bottom line is the UN needs to play a role in advocating for the continued relevance of the international human rights law framework, build the ecosystem, as the Singapore ambassador said, and experiment with multi-stakeholder processes.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm afraid one sentence. Julie, if I could ask you, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, just one sentence. I think two important words for human rights and emerging technologies are proactivity and collaboration between different set of actors. I think this is extremely urgent now. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And Stephen, if you have a last sentence for this panel, please.
I'm fortunate enough that my last sentence comes after two brilliant women speak, so I will just say I agree with everything they said.
That is a perfect ending sentence, I believe. And that was a very insightful panel. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the contributions from the floor. They were insightful and important. And we will now jump right into our next panel, which is a discussion concerning the report of the Advisory Committee on the potential impacts, opportunities, and challenges of new and emerging technologies with regards to the promotion and protection of human rights. So I now have the pleasure to introduce our wonderful speakers for this panel, and I will begin with the speaker who is going to also give us a short presentation of this report. So that is Professor Bakbom-Sook, who is a member of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee and the current rapporteur of the Advisory Committee for this report. He is an expert in international law on human rights, has served as an advisor to government agencies dealing with human rights issues, is an advisory member of the International Human Rights Committee under the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, an international director of the Korean Society of International Law, and an auditor of the Korea Human Rights Foundation. I would now like to invite you, Bom-Sook, to please present the findings of the report. You have the floor.
Thank you. It is my sincere pleasure to provide a brief overview of the Advisory Committee's report, which will be presented to UN Human Rights Council at its 47th session this month. The drafting group, which is currently composed of 11 committee members, was established in July 2019. In the same year, the drafting group distributed a questionnaire among different stakeholders. More than 100 responses were received from individual states, UN special procedures, civil society, and academic institutions. In addition, the drafting group and the entire committee has held several meetings to discuss the topic and the different views expressed by the member states and other stakeholders in those meetings. To discuss the human rights impact arising from new technologies, this report has several basic assumptions. First, it is an oversimplification to argue that technology are neutral objects and that negative consequences are purely the result of human misusing them. Technologies, not just the users, also have human rights consequences by limiting users' enjoyment of human rights or influencing a policy restricting individuals' liberties. The second assumption of this report is that the impact of technological systems on human rights cannot be understood or addressed in isolation. Although the Advisory Committee fully notes various critical human rights concerns surrounding their use in armed conflict situations, especially drones and autonomous weapons, this report exclusively focused on the civilian applications of these new technologies. The report recognized that new technologies have great potential to support individuals' rights and freedoms and to enhance the empowerment of individuals in the real world through new tools such as automation and robotics. However, not all technologies are initially designed to serve human rights purposes, and we need to be conscious of potential loopholes. Therefore, the report highlights that these new technologies pose significant challenges to human rights. These challenges are categorized into 7 groups. First, privacy violations can arise from excessive datafication by new technologies. Threat to privacy should not be dismissed at an inevitable price for progress because erosion of the right to privacy can weaken the entire human rights framework. And it is too complicated for average users to understand the data processing algorithms of digital services. Moreover, with the rapid spread of COVID-19 worldwide, some effort to combat the pandemic may be failing to meet the standards of legality, necessity, and proportionality. So even considering the gravity of pandemic situation, the critical question remains as to what extent government should access personal information. Second, poor cybersecurity may lead to severe violation of privacy. Business and governance models that rely on users' data are not easily reconciled with protecting individual right to privacy and minimizing personal data disclosure online. Third, with the digital revolution, information is cheaper and faster, but it's also increasingly difficult to separate it from misinformation. The internet has profoundly changed the way media contents are produced and experienced. New technologies render it even more challenging to maintain and access the authenticity of the information. First, new technologies easily enable the rapid spread of hate speech, resulting in radicalization, segregation, hate crimes, and discrimination. Digital media and social network can intensify hate speech and dissemination of hateful ideas. At the same time, even though unintended, discriminatory outcomes may result from AI decision-making if based on biased algorithms. Fifth, as the internet becomes the primary method of communication and access to information, human rights risks can negatively impact the vulnerable populations lacking digital access. The technological empowerment will likely continue to be uneven, aggravating existing inequalities or creating new forms of vulnerability. Sixth, illegal and arbitrary mass surveillance may occur, involving indiscriminate monitoring of the entire or significant portion of the population. All too often, surveillance is conducted without appropriate safeguards, which impinges unreasonably on the privacy. In the same vein, digital spaces are also used to curtail the freedom of expression, access to information, and the right to assembly. Seventh, new technologies have created new and unprecedented criminal challenges such as sexual exploitation, copyright infringement, financial extortion, and cyberbullying. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy also point out new technologies have amplified some forms of gender abuse. After examining the challenges and potential violation of human rights by new technologies, this report reviews the progress by the UN and international community in understanding and responding to the issue contingent on new technologies. The transboundary nature of new technologies and the business model show that domestic approaches alone are not enough. There is a growing need for a comprehensive approach to deal with this complex issue. The report maintains that new technologies and business models are putting the current international human rights framework under unprecedented strain and exposing gaps in ongoing responses. The first type of gaps are conceptual ones. Simply put, most international human rights instruments were initially drafted for the offline world and may not reflect the realities of the digital age, but the adoption of new treaties or international agreements or amending the existing ones seems not to be advisable. The engineering community lacks an understanding of human rights, and human rights communities does not have an understanding of the technologies. The new technological system may improve the enjoyment of one type of human rights, but simultaneously imperil the enjoyment of others, paradoxically resulting in a trade-off between human rights, between different human rights. Therefore, without firm guidance from human rights community, the designers of technological systems may end up picking and choosing which right to protect or not. Such a problem can be further complicated by the proliferation of different ethical principles and voluntary code of conduct that only cover a limited range of human rights. The second category of gaps consists of operational ones. This category focuses on how new technologies are causing practical challenges for states. Due to inevitable existence of gaps between the enactment of regulations and the development of new technologies, government need to expect voluntary compliance by the private sector, at least in a short term, because social consensus and consultation need to precede the enactment of regulations. Such operational gaps often involve broader questions of international governance too. New technologies are global and transnational in scope, but regulatory efforts tend to remain national or regional. Therefore, there is the possibility of overlaps as international institutions and UN member states begin to develop policies on new technologies independently. To minimize the gap, international consultation between states and international organizations is required to identify the overlaps and gaps in these regulatory efforts. Moreover, the private sector's growing role and its relationship with human rights protection is another crucial gap. Considerable progress has been made in raising the awareness of private sector of its human rights obligations through the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. However, there is still room for improvement because some innovative business models are purposely designed to exploit legal gray areas. Finally, this report concludes with the recommendations of the holistic human rights approach to new technologies, including the following 3 pillars. First is a holistic understanding of technology. It requires the awareness of the complexity and interdependency of new technologies and an understanding of the whole datafication cycle, not just the individual technology. In this regard, the interconnections between different types of innovations and their overall human rights consequences should be carefully traced. Moreover, it is critical to understand the human rights implication of each stage of development of technologies, including its design, manufacture, implementation, and even disposal. The second pillar is a holistic approach to human rights. It requires translating human rights norms into practical standards that are understandable for business and engineers. If the first pillar requires human rights experts learning about technologies, the second pillar requires teaching engineers about human rights. It is essential because many critical decisions that will affect users' human rights are made on the drawing boards by technical experts at the early stage of the development of technology. Designing process need to consider universal human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the rights of women, persons with a disability, children, and other vulnerable groups. The last pillar is the holistic governance and regulatory efforts by states, international organizations, and all relevant stakeholders. Accelerating the development and proliferation of new technologies seems inevitable, but their impacts on human rights can be effectively shaped through the joint efforts of multi-stakeholders. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Our second speaker is Ms. Peggy Hicks. Ms. Peggy Hicks has served as Director to the Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development Division of the United Nations Human Rights Office. She provides strategic direction to the UN Human Rights Office work on a broad range of pressing human rights issues, including human rights in the digital age and expanding civic space. From 2005 to 2015, she was Global Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, where she was responsible for managing Human Rights Watch's advocacy team and providing direction to its advocacy worldwide. Peggy, that was a lot of information, and I do apologize that your time has been eaten into. I'm sure you also have a lot of very interesting things to say and valuable contributions. So, without further ado, I would like to ask you to share your insights and immediate reactions to the report and possibly to some of the following questions. So one of the findings of the study is that there seems to be a growing disparity between the complex human rights issues created by new technologies and the lack of adequate platforms, processes, and resources for human rights mechanisms. So do you agree? And what options do you see to possibly react to this situation? Moreover, what could be an international approach to ensure access to remedy? And finally, human rights defenders need to keep pace with technological changes in their advocacy efforts, as I'm sure you're very familiar with. So how can we better support them and ensure meaningful civic engagement with regards to tech regulation? Peggy, I very much look forward to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. I'm glad to join you all. Others didn't get the dress code, but Charlotte and I are on board for the black and red combo here. I won't, there are so many questions, and obviously Mr. Beck has already given us a wonderful overview of the report, and there's so much meaty content in there that we could go to. But I thought I'd pick up a couple of the points that Charlotte has raised and really focus down on sort of 4 key points that I think are takeaways and are really echoed in the report. The first is that the report recognizes that there is so much guidance out there, so much work that's already been done with regard to the application of the human rights framework, but yet somehow we're not really using it as effectively as possible yet. So the first key point is that we need to dive deeper and resource better. And that means that we need to make sure that we're finding ways not to replicate, not to duplicate, not to proliferate additional guidance or try to create new standards, but really do our best to apply what we have in a most practical way and in a timely and relevant way. And I think that's work that we all can look at. And we on the human rights side are trying to do much more to make, for example, the multiple recommendations that have been made across dozens of reports by special procedures, to pull those together in a way where they're much more accessible and usable for companies and governments that are trying to apply that guidance in practical settings. In terms of resourcing better, I think we also need to really look at how we are able to provide authoritative guidance to governments and to pull together those resources in a way that can be more effective. We've got a proliferation of models developing across national, regional, and international frameworks, and it's often hard to understand which of those models are really based on the human rights guidance. And I do think one of the ideas that we've floated around is the idea of something like a Venice Commission that would be able to really help and provide advisory opinions and support in a more accurate way and a more accessible way for those that are trying to navigate the difficult space that we've heard about for the real bulk of this panel. I'd emphasize, though, for those that may be despairing after all this, given the complexities, that we've made real progress. The human rights framework, as Eileen Donahoe referenced, was really very unknown in many circles, as little as 5 years ago. And I heard a podcast recently that I'd recommend to all of you. It's one of the best ones, I think, on some of these issues, the Lawfare podcast, Arbiters of Truth, where one of the things they focused on was how much the dialogue has changed within technology companies and elsewhere in terms of the incorporation of human rights standards in the last 5 years. So we've made progress in getting the words in there. Now we just need to make sure we follow it up with concrete action that really puts those words into practice. The second point I'd make is that we really need to break down the silos and pull together the different discussions. Mr. Bake also emphasized this point, that there are many different avenues where this is working, and there's gaps between the way the technology sector is working and the human rights experts are working, and we need to find better ways to bring those pieces together. One area that we really emphasize, and one that picks up from the earlier panel, is that we also need to look at conversations, for example, around cybersecurity, around counterterrorism, and particularly around standard setting that my colleagues at ITU are very much engaged in. We find that those processes really don't have the transparency and the human rights engagement that they need to be frank. And we need to find better ways to integrate human rights into those conversations, and really looking forward to figuring out what are the ways that we can do that better. The third point I'd make is that both governments and companies have a long way to go to do better. I really appreciated the Austrian foreign minister's comments about the fact that the technology sphere is moving very quickly And we really are not keeping pace with the rights respecting rules that we need. And we see that in areas, for example, like facial recognition, where it's being rolled out in avenues that are critical for human rights, for example, in policing, yet there is no regulation guiding how that can be done in a rights respecting way. So we really need to move forward on this quickly and do better. And for governance, for governments, that means also looking at things like, how we make sure that we're doing this in a coherent way. If we try to do this, country by country, we are in danger of course, developing much different standards from place to place. And one of the things we're concerned about from a human rights perspective is that we'll set sort of the lowest common bar if we act in that way. So we do need to depend on these multilateral fora, and we can use them to develop red lines in terms of things that really, areas that shouldn't be crossed, but also in a proactive and forward-looking way to really provide model legislation and other efforts that can really feed into this in a way that makes sure that the examples we're replicating are good ones. We've heard from our colleagues at the European Union and elsewhere how, of course, the work that's done in one place does have a tendency to ripple out and be used elsewhere. And that does place a huge premium on those so-called early adopters to get it right. Unfortunately, we do see that, some real concerns arising in the way that states and others have taken up these issues. And we really want to make sure that we don't legislate quickly, but in a way that really infringes on rights. And we see that, for example, in online content areas where quick timeframes are being put in place on things like terrorist content that we are concerned will lead to overbroad interpretations that will infringe on free expression and not actually accomplish their goals as effectively as we'd like to see. Companies too, though, have a lot more to do. I'll try to cut I only have one more point, cut my comments short here, but one of the areas my office is working very extensively on is our BTEC project, which is really about how we take the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that give us some of those answers we're looking for, Charlotte, in the area of remedy and accountability, and can help us look at both state responsibilities, states' obligations, and companies' responsibilities in this space. The guiding principles on business and human rights, celebrating their 10th year this year, are a framework that gives us the tools to look at how companies cause, contribute, and are linked in to human rights violations, and specifically what they need to do when that happens. But they haven't been applied as easily or effectively in the tech sector as they might have been, for example, in the extractives or in areas where there's a clearer supply chain. Here, the digital supply chain, of course, can reach to millions, potentially even billions of users globally. So figuring out how we apply it effectively in that space is what our BTEC project is about, and we really look forward to working with all of you on that front. Finally, I'll close with my fourth point, which is about the fact that we have to, and I heard this from some of our speakers, but I think it's an important point to close on, we have to recognize the crucial role of civil society in these discussions, equations, and solutions. Unfortunately, I think we hear a lot of recognition about the role that civil society can and should play, but the reality is they are incredibly constrained in their ability to play that important role right now for a variety of reasons. For it's issues of resources, transparency, and also, of course, real openness to including them. On the resources side, the first starting point is the one that we heard so eloquently stated by my colleague from ITU and by Eileen Donahoe. If you don't have access to the internet, you have a problem. And of course, that is something that really applies for many groups. They may be working in areas where they are not able to use these tools because they simply do not have that digital access. But we also know it's not just places where it's not available for everybody. We also see specific shutdowns and denials of service focused on civil society and those that we want to engage. And lots of good reporting is happening on the way that those impact not just rights in the civil and political sphere, but economic and social rights as well. So we really need to address internet shutdowns and denials of service. We also, though, know that even when civil society is connected, they face threats and attacks that make it very difficult for them to engage in the digital space. There are, for example, tools of digital surveillance that have been rolled out in some 45 different countries developed by NSO that impact on the ability of civil society to engage in the space effectively. We also see that technology is used to silence the voices of NGOs through trolling and attacks online, particularly against women in this space as well. And then finally, I'd say that to address those issues, we have to address the resilience of our civil society actors. We have to give them that space at the table, but we also have to give them the tools to push back on these constraints that they face in being part of the space. And recognize, of course, that when we're addressing the online problems, it is inherently connected to what happens to them offline. So we need to look at it in a holistic way, as Mr. Bake has emphasized as well. So those are the 4 key points I'd make. They're all, I think, follow very well on the report, which is a great contribution in the space. And thanks for giving me the time to address you all.
Thank you so much. This has been very informative and thought-provoking and very on point. So we have a list of speakers now for statements from the floor. And if you would like to speak as well, I invite you to raise your hand virtually. Please try and keep your interventions short and to the point. So we will be having interventions from the United Kingdom, the International Development and Law Organization, Women in AI, Slovenia, the Dominican Republic, and Canada. I would now like to invite to the floor Mrs. Verity Robson, Legal Counselor from the Mission of the United Kingdom. Ms. Robson, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I will indeed try to be brief. The United Kingdom really welcomes today's timely discussion, and thanks Mr. Bake and the Advisory Committee for their useful new report. The UK strongly supports a free, open, peaceful and secure internet, and we are committed to protecting and defending all human rights online as well as offline, including the rights to privacy and freedom of expression. As this new report makes clear, new technologies are not inherently bad or good. The same technology can both liberate and repress. States have a responsibility to ensure that new technologies are used in a way that meets their human rights obligations. The Human Rights Council has a vital role to play in developing a rights framework to inform and influence the development and application of new technologies. We must reach out to those shaping the technology of the future and encourage dialogue and collaboration. This will require genuine international cooperation in light of the global implications of new technologies and our growing interdependencies. The UK therefore welcomes the report's focus on inclusive and multi-stakeholder approaches, which are vital to effective cooperation on these issues. While states are responsible for protecting human rights, all stakeholders have a role to play if we are to successfully harness the benefits that derive from new and emerging digital technologies and push back against those who seek to use them to undermine human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Ms. Silvia Dodero from the Permanent Delegation of the International Development Law Organization. Ms. Dodero, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning and good evening to everyone. Thank you for organizing this extremely timely and interesting event and for the possibility to intervene. My name is Silvia Dodero. I'm Senior Advocacy Officer at IDLO, International Development Law Organization, which is the only global intergovernmental organization exclusively devoted to the promotion of rule of law and access to justice. And this is why I want to thank Germany for the reference to the importance of the respect of rule of law, and also Ms. Peggy Hicks for her focus on the importance of access to remedies and accountability. And I would like to address a question to Ms. Peggy Hicks, also considering our cooperation over the past years, and asking if she may focus and elaborate a bit more on the ways in which to assist member states in developing appropriate actions and policies to close the digital divide in order to guarantee access to justice, especially for vulnerable and marginalized groups, because we consider access to justice as an essential enabler of human rights. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. And I would suggest that we are going to pose that question to Peggy at the end of the floor. So next we have Ms. Karina Sedmeier from Women in AI. Karina, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the permanent missions of Austria, the Republic of Korea, Brazil, Denmark, Morocco, Singapore, and the Office of the High Commissioner for convening this very important meeting. We very much welcome the findings of the report, and we are very much looking forward to reading them. Also, a big thank you to everyone who highlighted the role of NGOs in this process. My name is Karina Sedmeier, and I'm here as a representative of Women in Artificial Intelligence, a global nonprofit working towards increasing female representation and participation in the field of AI. We have more than 6,000 members from over 100 countries. And just to react also to what Ms. Hicks said, we are an interdisciplinary organization, and we are trying to break the silos through helping developers understand the role of human rights and social scientists to get inspired in the field of tech. As you all know, AI is a very powerful technology. It can help us predict and prevent conflicts and natural disasters, and even fight a pandemic. But also it brings a lot of challenges. To highlight a few of them, AI, especially machine learning, is used to take decisions with far-reaching implications for our lives, often without us even being aware and no mechanisms to complain. As mentioned several times today, AI algorithms and datasets can reflect unfair biases we have in our societies and can even reinforce discrimination through the perception of machine neutrality. It is the role of all of us, the Council, states, companies, and NGOs, to make sure that the technology is used in a way to help us reduce discrimination and create a fairer society. AI only works if it works for all, and diversity is key. But today, only 22% of AI professionals globally are women. Ladies and gentlemen, there is not only a global digital divide, but also a global gender divide that needs to be closed. Therefore, we urge the Council to increase its work on artificial intelligence and the impact of AI technology on human rights, with a special focus on the topic of bias and how to include everyone, especially women and girls, in the process of shaping the future that we want to live in. Also, human rights play a tremendous role in the design, development, and deployment of AI technology. Therefore, we also ask the Council to take a look at the guiding principles for business and human rights and consider elaborating a human rights impact assessment for the ones developing the technology, but also for the ones using the technology, including states and international organizations. We are observing the work done by the Council with great interest, and we are looking forward to the upcoming resolution and to actively engage in future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Sabina Carli from the Permanent Mission of Slovenia to the floor. Ms. Carli, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you to today's speakers, to the core group and the Office of the High Commissioner for organizing today's event and really sharing some very interesting insights into the sphere. Slovenia is a strong supporter of promoting a responsible, human-centered approach to development and use of digital technologies with a particular focus on artificial intelligence. Showing Slovenia's strong commitment to the introduction of advanced technologies where AI is of particular importance, Ljubljana is hosting a UNESCO International Research Center on Artificial Intelligence. We are a founding member of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence called GPAY and active supporter of the Council of Europe's ongoing work in the Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, CAHAI, which has already been mentioned today during the discussions. What we pay an increased attention to are the domains of privacy, personal data protection, non-discrimination, and equality, because automated processing techniques and algorithms, internet shutdowns, censorship, cyber attacks, and surveillance could have an incremental implications on human rights in the field of right to a fair trial, due process, privacy and data protection, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so on. There are two aspects that I want to particularly emphasize today in the light of the discussion. And these are, firstly, gender and also generational digital divide, and the fact that women are underrepresented in almost all areas of ICT education, employment, entrepreneurship, and leadership, but also in the field of regulation and the discussions on the legal arrangements in the field of digital technologies. And secondly, the second aspect, digital environment is an important aspect of children's lives. It offers new opportunities for the realization of their human rights, children's rights, but at the same time, even if children themselves are not using the internet and digital technologies, it opens space for risk of violation and abuse of their rights. The right of every child must be respected, protected, and fulfilled also in the digital environment. An important point has been raised today on cross-sectoral cooperation between organizations that address digital issues. While there is a number of international forums where the challenges that the new technologies bring are opened, Slovenia sees a particularly important role that the Human Rights Council needs to play in this regard. And we are looking forward to working with you, with the core group on this topic at the upcoming council and also in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next up, we're going to have Christian Roy, First Secretary from Cybersecurity and Digital Affairs from the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Christiane, if you would please take the floor.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the core group for organizing this event, for the OHCHR, your contribution and your constant support to us, to member states. It's really, truly appreciated. And, you know, I've been working in this field for many, many years. And again, today, I'm learning of new actors in this field that I wasn't aware of. For instance, Mrs. Zeitmeyer's group on women in AI, and I'm very interested in reaching out to you. So really, these events are very important for the connections that we can establish. Canada also wants to express its gratitude to the Advisory Committee for preparing this report, which illuminates potential ways forward. It's really a pleasure to be amongst like-minded partners who strongly agree that human rights apply online and to all digital technologies. We must continue to work together now to identify how the international human rights framework applies to the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of the digital technologies, because we agree that international law must apply. Now we need to clarify the how and give the tools to all actors to do so. We have been hearing a very troubling narrative emerge internationally from various parts that our hard-fought international human rights framework may not be fit for purpose when it comes to digital technology. And Canada, of course, believes that this assessment is completely inaccurate or at the very least, perhaps premature. But in our view, human rights apply regardless of the technology or the innovations of the day. This narrative that it may not apply in the digital world also risks co-option from authoritarian forces wishing to undermine human rights. The fact that the international community has not yet completed a sufficient legal analysis on how the international human rights framework applies to digital technology is maybe a necessary step before determination can be made on whether conceptual gaps exist. Canada does acknowledge that there are many operational challenges that exist in applying international human rights framework to digital technologies, as the report does outline. And many of these challenges, including the lack of adequate resources for human rights mechanisms, they're not unique to technology. And we agree also with the report's recommendations that such challenges must be addressed through initiatives such as funding relevant research and adopting a multi-stakeholder approach, which is truly essential in this field of technology. And on this point, I'd like to briefly share an initiative that Canada is pursuing to this end. We are going to be partnering, or we are partnering, with Global Partners Digital, GPD, who are UK-based social purpose company, to develop a roadmap towards a legal analysis of how international human rights law applies to artificial intelligence. And of course, we would be pleased to update this group on this work in a year's time. And we're happy to connect with anyone who are in this session and who might be interested in collaborating in this. And as well as some of you may be aware, Canada will be chairing the Freedom Online Coalition. So the coalition is a group of states who are willingly associated to defend human rights in the online context. This year, we're under the chairmanship of Finland, and next year, Canada will be taking over. And we're looking forward to exploring how the Freedom Online Coalition and the Human Rights Council can continue to collaborate on these questions through a multi-stakeholder approach. Again, thank you very much for this session. It was extraordinarily informative. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. So now to finalize our second panel of the day, I would like to ask our speakers for their closing statements. And again, I would invite you to keep them short and to the point. And maybe, Bamsuk, if I could ask you to kindly tell our audience as well where they can locate and read the report. So maybe if you could take the floor first, please.
Okay, I just want to emphasize two things. I believe to effectively implement and enforce human rights framework to new technologies and to have a sustainable monitoring system, multi-stakeholder engagement, especially meaningful participation of civil society, is essential. Secondly, I also want to emphasize that it is necessary to expand the civic education on the linkage between new technology and human rights issues, especially noting of impact on marginalized and vulnerable groups of the society. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could just add as well where the report could be found. Peggy, if you would like to add your closing statement.
Thanks very much. I have Sylvia's question to get to too, which was a great one. And I think it fits in well with the final point that I wanted to make, which is when we look at how best to assist member states in really important sectors like access to justice, I think one of the key tools that we have to look at is human rights due diligence and how we're using it. And of course, the approach that has been really gaining steam in some places, including in the EU, is around mandatory human rights due diligence as a way to make sure that, especially in critical human rights sensitive sectors, like the justice sector, we have in place the right standards before we jump into use of new technologies in ways that could have really adverse human rights impacts. So, I think that's really something that we need to explore. At the same time, of course, we have to recognize that we can't mandate things without giving states and others the resources to be able to do this hard work. So I do want to emphasize, I think we've heard so much today about how urgent and how important all this work is, and to really ask everyone present, are we really putting in the resources necessary to meet the challenges that we've all talked about? And I think we really see across regions in particular that states are struggling with these issues. And we have a lot of focus in Western Europe and in developed world, but in the lesser developed countries, finding the way to make sure that some of these critical issues are addressed in the best way means putting some resources behind this and really working with these states in ways that will help us to make the right solutions. And then finally, I just emphasize, because I think I've been focusing a lot on some of the problems here, we do need to bear in mind that new technologies can also be part of the solution to help us address some of these issues. So for example, our office is really looking at how we can use open source monitoring and technologies that allow us to access information in different ways to be able to do human rights work better. And we can also use these technologies to address some of the problems that we've talked about in today's workshop and really find ways to apply them better. And as many have said, I really do hope that the Human Rights Council and the UN more broadly is a forum in which we can really have serious conversations about how best to do that. It's a pivotal moment. We really are at a turning point where these new technologies can really advance our approaches to human rights globally, or we can go the other direction. And I think we all present, those of you who have stuck out to the end of this call, know that we really need to invest to make sure that we tip in the right direction towards a more human rights respecting future that relies on new technologies, but also ensures that the negative consequences are held way in check. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so thank you very much as well for all of your contributions and for the speakers for joining this panel. The topic is obviously very timely and important, and I believe that a lot of necessary ground for further actions has been covered today. And I'm sure we're all very excited to see how these discussions will inform ongoing efforts. I now hand over to His Excellency Lee Tae-oh, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations in Geneva, for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in bringing this session to a close, I would like to express my sincere appreciation, my special thanks to the panelists, the moderator, and the audience for your valuable contributions. I believe your insightful observations and perspectives have made today's panel discussion such a useful and inspiring one. While digital transformation has brought about profound changes to our lives and society, its impacts, opportunities, and challenges relating to the enjoyment of human rights are not yet fully understood. In this context, today's discussion was a sobering reminder of the need to take a holistic and multi-stakeholder approach to further our common understanding of human rights implications of new technologies. Hearing from various voices on the ground, we could recognize the importance of breaking the silos that may exist between the human rights community and the tech industry so as to integrate human rights into the design and deployment of new technologies. We have also gained valuable insights today from key members of the advisory committee and the OHCHR on how the human rights pillar of the United Nations can play a role in clarifying human rights norms as they pertain to new technologies. For that matter, thank you once again. As reflected in the advisory committee's report, it is important that the Council and the OHCHR continue to expand their roles in providing guidance on how human rights standards apply in digital space. Dear distinguished guests, I'm certain that the takeaways from today's discussion will further deepen our understanding and accelerate our joint efforts to maximize the benefits of new technologies and curtail their unintended consequences. I appreciate once again your valuable input to the discussions. In closing this session, I would like to convey my sincere gratitude to the colleagues of the Austrian mission, the core group members, and the OHCHR for their valuable and close cooperation in organizing this virtual event. Finally, my deepest thanks are, of course, reserved for the Diplo Foundation for its invaluable support that enabled this event to run smoothly. I look forward to seeing you all at the 47th session of the Council next week, and I wish you a pleasant morning and evening. Thank you very much.